Chapter 2 covers human resource strategy and planning. If you recall from Chapter 1, we covered briefly strategy and the long-term process, and now we'll dig deeper into that and factor in the making of plans, both short-term and long-term, and how the human resource team is a beneficial component and a resource for that. By the end of the chapter, you should be able to summarize the process, the strategic planning process that organizations undergo, explain those key differences between ineffective and effective strategies, and suggest certain ways that you can be able to implement asset reallocation in a strategic way. You should be able to outline the strategies that human resource professionals are involved with and how those are merged within the organization's larger overarching strategies. And you should be able to provide 2 examples of that process. You should be able to discuss how to forecast supply and demand of HR, the options for handling shortage and surplus of employees, how organizations can measure and analyze the effectiveness of HR management practices. So in Chapter 1, we talked about strategy, and that is a plan that we use, a long-term plan that we use to be able to compete, survive, thrive, be successful, grow, reach organizational goals. And when we're looking at strategic planning, we're having to take that long-term plan and define it and help to create any kind of direction or how we're going to allocate resources so that we can achieve that goal. So that we can say we need these individuals, we need this much money, we need this physical location, we need relationships with these external stakeholders, things of that nature. So let's look at figure 2.1, which shows you the process, how it starts with the organizational mission. The mission always tells you why the organization is in existence, why you come to work 5 to 7 days a week, why you do the things that you do. Then it translates into an analysis, a SWOT analysis that looks at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for that organization. From there, you'll establish goals and objectives, formulate the organizational strategy, that long-term strategy the organization is going to follow through with, formulate any kind of functional strategies that will support the organizational strategy. Then you have to implement it. You have to actually do it, get the job done. And then as you're doing the work, you have to be able to evaluate what's being done, reassess anything that needs to be tweaked, to have your contingency plan, your backup plan, that plan B, C, D through Z. And then the system, it just keeps going, making sure that you are focusing on reaching those goals and objectives. So I've already answered that, all right? It's why you're in existence. An organization's mission statement should not be lengthy. It should be something that every team member can recite immediately to know, why are we here? If we're here to be the number 1 provider of widgets, then that's what your mission is. That's what gets you up every day. That's what makes you clock in early and stay late. That's what makes you deal with disgruntled employees and customers, whatever, right? That is the core mission, the core reason. The strategy can cover a 3 to 5 year span. It can also be longer. And it's going to, as I mentioned earlier, look at both your internal and external forces and resources. And it's important that managers, and it's usually your senior leaders, but in smaller organizations, it can go all the way to your front line. But there's usually your senior leaders that are focused on strategy. Your mid-level managers are usually focused on the tactical plans. They break down that strategy to a tactical plan. And then your frontline managers are usually focused on operations and how to operationalize that plan and to make it into the day-to-day functions and processes. So this is usually a senior level management focus. When you're combining the overarching organizational strategy with HR management, you're now going to provide input on how you can use specific HR initiatives to help achieve those goals. And then at that point, you have to make sure that you're applying specific practices that will help you to not only gain, but keep a competitive advantage. So you can provide and help support the strategy by making sure that you hire good employees, placing them in the right jobs, rewarding them fairly, providing proper on-time training that's reinforced, foster good relationships and communication between the employer and the employee through management and employees, right? And focusing on the efforts of your employees and how best to reward them so that you can be able to reach that bottom line. And even after you've covered that, after you're making a profit, how you can keep reinforcing that and rewarding them and finding out what actually motivates your employees. Some people are motivated by money. Some people are motivated by receiving gifts. Some are fine with a pat on the back. Some need public recognition. And so making sure that you can focus on those types of efforts and rewards. And then when you're positioning HR to be a strategic partner with the senior most leaders of the organization, you're looking at how to aspire in ways that can support the strategy, expressing the direction of goals, how to motivate your managers to act. Oftentimes managers are less proactive and they're kind of more reactionary, or they kind of are just content with being in the shadows and not speaking up. So it's making sure that you're having managers that are very engaged in the process of managing to be leaders, not just managing functions and processes. And then inspiring others to be able to support that strategy. So you're encouraging that coordinated goal setting where everyone is reflecting on the goals, where you currently stand, where you want to be, and how everyone can help contribute towards actually attaining that goal. Some other things is to look at how you can provide your own perspective and expertise by making sure that you have a seat at that table where you're sitting there with the senior leaders that make those decisions, where you're knowledgeable about the operations of that organization and you have a future focus, where you're understanding what's presently taking place, but understanding where the organization wants to go. Because remember, you must align to where the mission is. And so you have to be able to combine the mission of why we're here with the vision of where we want to be. And that is your future. And then you have to be able to prioritize the goals of the organization. What's the most important to the least important, and making sure that you have those in place and understanding what needs to be measured and when it needs to be measured and how it needs to be measured. All of those need to be factored in because you take those measurements and that's how you're able to then gauge whether or not something is successful or not, or something needs to be improved or just continued. Then when we look at sustainability, we look at our internal and external influences and our environment of our leadership and corporate structure and our values and culture, and how that then rolls into our sustainability of making sure that our HR practices are transformational and transactional, right? We're looking at strategy and culture, as well as how that translates into pay and training, where there's an exchange that takes place that can be tracked. And then that then factors into the different challenges that we must always be considerate of, in the fact that every organization needs greater transparency for employees to be able to truly understand what is going on in the minds of their leaders within the organization, but also there has to be a sense of transparency to an extent to your stakeholders that are in the community, that may be actual shareholders of a company, and so on and so forth. then you have to look at the fact that your stakeholders, both internally and externally, have expectations of this organization. And then decreasing your impact on natural resources, decreasing how much you're taking from the environment, from earth, from the water, and so on and so forth, so that you're leaving a smaller imprint. So you're doing less damage than those before you. Now, when we look at competing globally, you can, as I mentioned in chapter 1, there are organizations that are multinational corporations that you have facilities and other assets that are in at least one other country in addition to your home country. And so you're having to consider all of the different factors that impact your home operations as well as your overseas operations. So there's some strategies that you need to take into consideration when you're thinking about how to staff those organizations. Now, most people look at outsourcing and they think they're confusing sometimes outsourcing with offshoring. Outsourcing is anytime you have a job or role, a function that you give out, that you delegate outside of your organization to have someone else do it that is not internal within your organization. Offshoring, and that could be domestically or internationally. It could be something where you may not have a human resource team. Well, you can actually outsource that to a human resource provider who will actually do the work for you. Same thing when it comes to accounting for your payroll. Offshoring is when you relocate your business, either the process of it or the operations of it, to another country from your own. So you're going to actually possibly have another entity, or you create another division that is in another country that handles that. So it could be an actual process as far as, your customer support or IT or whatever, that is literally now being handled in another country. Sometimes that is done for efficiency. Sometimes it's done to reduce cost. I mentioned in chapter 1 about an expatriate. That's anytime you're employed in a second country by a company from your first country. So you can, the home country can be in the United States and you're now living abroad in Japan. Leadership development, of course, is always critical because you're having to take into consideration that these are different cultures, customs, expectations, rules, laws, and you have to be able to be strong in understanding and appreciating diversity and being able to understand the cultures and customs of different people, and that it is a skill that is always constantly being massaged and tweaked so that you can be better as you're representing your company and your country in multiple areas. When we look at how we staff internationally, we have to look at the fact that there's an ethnocentric policy where you're making sure that where you have managers who could be in headquarters, let's say we're talking about Atlanta, Georgia, and here in the United States, and they're having to staff for key positions outside of that. And so you're making sure to control over the locations that elsewhere, both also domestically, but also internationally, and making sure that the policies that you have in place in your home country, those same policies are translated properly and transferred properly to any subsidiary locations. When you look at a polycentric policy, you have the host country nationals that are going to staff those key positions. And this helps to reduce any kind of hiccups that can take place, any misunderstandings culturally, because what happens is that you're having people that are in and from that culture and that country that can then translate and make better sense of and make sure that things are applicable based to that home country. Regiocentric is focusing on a region. So it could be the EU, right? Which of course you know is a cluster of European countries. And with there, it's going to capitalize on the fact that there are certain similarities to culture and language within that one region. Geocentric is going to look at a huge array of skilled managers that are going to be assigned and to global subsidiaries, and it's not specific to any kind of nationality. And so there, your technical and managerial expertise is then leveraged. When we look at HR planning, we're going to look at and identify and analyze the need for certain people, the availability of those people, so that we can meet our strategic objectives as an organization. And so you have to have the right number of people that are capable, that are highly skilled, and that these people are being trained and put into a position at the right time, at the right place, doing the right things, so that everything then lines up in order to, once again, meet that goal. Here is a visual of that where you review, analyze that plan, is then assessed, and you're looking both internally and externally to the organization. You'll then compile all of your forecast, how you project where something is going to be, and you plan accordingly for the demand on HR and the supply of the human talent that you have, and then develop the plans and actions to make sure that you can retain employees, reduce or cap turnover, and be able to recruit from various resources in various ways, and then the process that you take in order to select a talented group of people that will help you reach your goals. When we scan environmentally, we're making an assessment of our internal and external environments that can impact the organization. It could be economic, political, competitive, which we talked about in chapter 1. Internally, it could be the quality and quantity of the talent that you have. The organizational culture, which is, remember, I talked about in chapter 1, that always starts at your senior most level and it weeds its way through. And then, of course, looking at the pipeline of talent that you have and the bench strength of your leadership team. How strong are they individually and collaboratively? And then you have to, of course, identify those strengths that your organization possesses, as well as the weaknesses, opportunities, and any threats that can potentially derail you from your plans. When we look at strengths, there's something that usually people don't oftentimes factor in, because they usually think about financial. But if you think about how many of your employees, or do you have loyal, committed employees? Are they innovative and adaptive to change? Change is inevitable. Do your employees embrace it, or do they resist it? Strengths are very important, but you also need to consider, what are your weaknesses? Do you have a small number of skilled employees and you need more? Or is your practices for managing your talent outdated? Is there a leadership pipeline that is lacking? What opportunities do you have? Do you have the ability to expand globally? Do you have any technological advances that could be used at your that you can actually embrace and implement? Are there some markets that haven't been explored that you have the opportunity to enter? What threats do you have? If you have a shortage of talent, you have to then acknowledge that and say, okay, we have to find a way to fill this gap. Are we unsure about where we stand economically? Do we have enough to sustain ourselves during a crisis or anything? How strong is our competition? And what are the different restrictions and mandates that are placed against us legally that can actually prevent us from making certain decisions? Succession planning is when you sit back and you create a plan that factors in what happens when your key employees either quit, are fired, or they pass away. They're no longer there. Who is going to succeed them next in line? And you have to make sure that this plan is always updated on a consistent basis. Some things that you should be mindful of externally of the workforce about your availability is how the government and economy impacts your planning as an HR professional. There's various regulations, tax legislation, how your competitors and the geographic map as a whole, how you evaluate them, both your direct competitors, your indirect competitors, and any competitors you have internationally. And then looking at how, as we talked about in chapter 1, the workforce is constantly changing. The aging of our workforce, 40 and older, you're considered aged. The diversity of workers, we're having all different kinds of customs and cultures and genders and classifications. Understanding you have workers with various restrictions and limitations, as well as you have workers who are having greater skill sets in other areas. Looking at the fact of female workers and work-life balance concerns. And this is not just work-life balance concerns of women, but it's also work-life balance concerns of men, because you're having a growing interest of men who are saying, wait a minute, I'm not being able to spend more time with my family. I don't have the ability to care for an aging parent or grandparent. I need paternity time to be able to take off work to spend time with my newborn child. So these are concerns that are coming up more frequently. The availability of contingent workers, and these are people that you have in place who can come in part-time and help out. They're temporary. They fill in those gaps anytime you have them. Outsourcing possibilities, your ability to help reduce your overhead by possibly outsourcing a workload or a project to an external company or entity that can actually handle certain things for you, which could mean that you could actually reduce the cost that you're spending in recruiting and training, as well as the square footage of having workers in an actual physical building. We have to also make sure that we stay on top of current and future job audits, looking at existing jobs, how many people we have performing a job, what they're doing. Is anyone doing it differently? Is one way more efficient than another way? Reporting the various relationships and looking at our knowledge, skills, abilities. Those are the KSAs. And which ones are most vital? How jobs are implemented for our future strategies, and the various characteristics of jobs that we anticipate to have in the future. Then we have to also be able to create an inventory, a list of the demographics of our employees, looking at all the different variables that are aligned with our employees to see where everyone comes from, the different customs and cultures and religions and thought processes, backgrounds, if we have military personnel, if we have people with specialized degrees. So you look at all those demographics. Do you have anyone that's from a certain region of a country? Then we can also map out the progression of our employees' career before they were with us, while they're with us, and if any transition on. Sometimes some companies will track to see how those employees have used the company as a stepping stone, and now they've gone on to bigger and brighter things or different pastures or whatever. And then of course we keep track of the data of how our employees are performing, how certain products are performing aligned with the employee productivity. And so all of these are kept in inventory so that you can actually track your individual employees, track a department division, track a time frame to see how well you're responding. It can also help during times of crisis to see how you were performing before, during, and after that crisis. As I mentioned earlier, forecasting is where you're going to use information from the past and present to predict where you think that you will be in the future. There are various ways and methods that we use that. Judgmental is providing estimates. We're going to use a rule of thumb. Mathematical is going to be statistical regression. You can use some simulation. There's always some type of ratio involved versus productivity and staffing. And there are various periods, short-term, intermediate, and long. Your short term is what you need immediately, right now. The first, it could be any time within 1 month to 1 year. Intermediate is going to be 1 to 3 years on average, and it could be up to 5. And then long range is going to extend beyond that 3 to 5 year range. Then we can look at outside the external supply that we have to be able to make sure that we keep a strong, vibrant workforce, and making sure that we're looking at those that are coming in and leaving the workforce, who's graduating from school, college, the composition and patterns of the workforce, what economic factors that we can forecast in the next few years, any kind of developments and shifts in technology, what other organizations are doing, what are they doing to better their workforce, to recruit and train, all of those factors. You're always looking at your competition, what kind of regulations and pressures that we have from government, and any kind of circumstances that could potentially block talent from coming to our organization or leaving. And then we estimate internally the labor supply, and we're looking at a specific unit. And so you can take your current staffing level, and from there you deduct the projected outflows that's going to take place in the current year. You add that with your projected inflows for this year, and then from there you'll be able to determine your internal supply for the next year. And so your inflows are your external hires, your permitting promotions, demotions. Your outflows are turnover, promotions, if anyone passes away, retires, if there's layoffs. And from there you can see where you can have your staffing tracked, where you can actually create replacement charts. You can create those succession planning, because then you're going based on position, based on department and division, and making sure that if something were to ever happen to Jim or to Keisha or to Sally or to Michael, then you're like, okay, who would be next to replace them? And if there's no one internally, then we need to make sure that we have someone in mind externally. If possible, we can have an interim person, and you see that a lot, like with colleges and universities. They'll have an interim president, an interim dean, until they can fill that position. How we go about managing these imbalances is that we can have a surplus or a shortage. And with the surplus, you can reduce employee work hours or their compensation. You can create hiring freezes to prevent any more employees from being hired. You can also downsize or reduce the in-force of your team. While you have a shortage, of course, you can increase work hours through overtime. You can outsource work to a third party. You can use temporary independent contractors. Those are the contingent workers. You can also focus on reducing employee turnover. Now, the best practices to carry out for layoffs is making sure that you protect the bottom line in the corporate brand, right? That's one of the best practices. Paying attention to those that survive the layoffs. Oftentimes what organizations do is they do a major layoff and they don't go back to check on the health and wellness and well-being of your survivors, those that did not get laid off, because it is a detrimental impact. What happens is it psychologically rattles the employees, because no one knows who's going to be next. No one knows when it's going to happen. And after you've done the layoff, no one is quite sure if whether or not you're done laying off. So people tend to freak out. So you need to make sure you pay attention to those that survive the cut. Constantly staying in communication with employees, being very transparent, letting them know what's going on. What happens is when you're not open, you don't share, employees freak out. They start to try to abandon ship because they don't want to get blindsided with the layoff. So those are some of the ways. When you look at severance benefits and how you can go about outplacement services, the severance is temporary, and that's what you provide to help ease the burden and pain when you lay off an employee and they're now in unemployment status. Some various outplacement services is the ability to provide support and assistance through career counseling, helping prepare resumes, creating workshops so that employees are better prepared at going through interviews, and also providing referral assistance. You do have some senior leaders and CEOs who will actually go about writing letters of recommendation, or they'll actually make direct contact with other employers to see about getting you placed in a new job. Some different considerations that need to be taken care and thought out properly for legally to help with reduction of workforce is the criteria that you use for laying off people. What do you go about and to make sure that you're not violating any of the Civil Rights, Employment, or Americans with Disability Acts? Because sometimes what people do is they're quick to let go of the older employees, those employees with disabilities, or people of color or women, right? And so making sure that those are not being violated. Other things is looking at as COBRA, the Benefit Protection Act for Older Workers, and WARN, which is helping with adjustment and retraining of your workers. Now, when we have a talent shortage, you can come up with two different plans to alternate your work arrangements or outsource the work. The alternate work arrangements is non-traditional schedules that provides more flexibility for employees. It could be something where it's a 10 to 7, or it's, you alternate the days off in a work week, certain things that are just not typical. Outsourcing, as I've mentioned before, you're going to transfer certain things to an external service provider. There are a ranking of how you should handle talent shortage. First, of course, is your use of overtime. Then it goes down to outsourcing the work out, trying alternative work arrangements, bringing back recent retirees, those who retired, and you're like, you know what, let's bring them back. They know the job, they can do it well, and we can, have them come in part-time or even full-time, and you just, different pay. You can increase the amount of temporary and independent contractors that you have, and then, of course, reducing your turnover. During mergers and acquisitions, you have 3 phases. Before the deal, right? Before the deal is closed, and of course, merging is literally you're having 2 companies that come together, and under this merger and an acquisition is a company is being bought out from another company. So before the deal, you have to make sure that you're doing due diligence, meaning you're doing all the research necessary. You're you're doing SWOT both on yourself, but also on that other company, internally and externally. You're assessing all risk, identifying if there's any possible conflicts of interest, anything that could potentially hinder this deal. While you're either being merged or acquired during that integration, you're having to make sure you address the key HR processes and functions so that it is seamless. You're making sure that you're retaining your key talent. There's certain people that may not make it through this transition. And then you're recognizing the cultural differences, not just what you perceive as culturally as far as race and things of that nature, but remember we talked about the cultural environment and making sure that one way that a company is operated and managed and functioned, it may conflict with another. So if you have one organization that is very aggressive and cutthroat and dog eat dog, and then you have another organization that is very family feeling and everyone is very close knit and it's very kind and loving, that could actually have a major damaging result. Now, once the organizations have either merged or one has been gobbled up and acquired by the other, that's called your post-integration. And at that point, you have to optimize the workforce. You have to be able to rally everyone up to get everyone on the same page, making sure there's no overlap. All of that is just now reinforced and reinvigorated. And then you have to then identify and establish an absolute new culture. Because remember, you have these two separate cultures. They could be very different or slightly different, but now you have to establish a new one. This is now the new family, the new environment. This is how now we will engage and interact. And this is how we're going to do business from this point on. I mentioned the due diligence, and so to break this down even more, you're doing a comprehensive, it's a deep, detailed assessment of everything about that organization. It's like being the top ranked stalker on the planet, right? But you're focusing from an HR viewpoint. And you're going to review any legal compliance issues, how they handle their compensation and benefits programs, if they have one or not, how qualified and are their talent, how many people, any obligations they have under labor contracts, anything, all the positives and negatives of that organization. Usually the most complex M&A is usually when you have companies in different countries, because now it's even longer period of time and there's more variables to have to factor in. Now, when we go about changing the culture, you're having to define, as I mentioned earlier, those behaviors. How are we going to conduct ourselves? Who are the actual role models in this organizational structure that we want the other employees to follow? And what kind of incentives can we provide that will encourage everyone to embrace this new culture? And making sure that we provide very clear, very consistent messages. There's no inconsistency in any way throughout. And then we have to be able to measure how effective we are with our resources and with the talent that we have. And understanding there's a difference between effectiveness and efficiency. Effectiveness is your ability to actually produce a specific result, right? You can actually get to that result, and that result can be measured. Efficiency is the degree in which you can carry it out, right? And specifically in the business realm is how you can carry it out economically, where you're like, okay, we understand that we have been able to do this. We can measure that we've done it. And on this end, we can tell you how much it cost us in time and money. Then we go through the measurement of our practices, which are called HR metrics. And then looking at the decisions that we make on the human resource management side, through using evidence-based approach of what was done, how it was done, and then making those decisions on the basis of a quantitative tool and model, meaning based on the reports that are derived from the actual numbers of people that have done X, Y, and Z. And so that's quantitative. Qualitative would be if we sat down and did interviews and allowed people to express certain elements of that, and from there we create a theme that then helps guide us. So this is all down to reports and numbers and data, and those are the analytics that can be used. And so here are some of the key HR metrics. When we look at staff and expenses, we can look at the HR to employee ratio, the total HR staff. When we look at staffing, we can see the cost per hire, how much our turnover rate is every year. Some companies don't do it, they need to. Compensation, the benefit cost as a percentage of payroll, the annual wage and salary increase, or if it just stays the same for 3 years. Training, the hours of training per employee and the cost of that training. How well we retain our employees, how long they normally stay, how many stay for 90 days. Because that's usually a pivotal time, because most organizations, of course, can fire you within the first 90 days without an excuse, right, in most states. And so also within those 90 days, how many employees can actually make it through that 90-day trial period? That's usually the period of time in which companies determine whether or not you have what it takes. When we look at development, we look at the positions that we fill internally versus those that we post for external applicants, and how many of those employees percentage-wise have a career path plan in place. Remember, not just saying, okay, this is the position you're going to have. You're going to always be a customer service rep. Okay, where would this person like to be in 1 year, in 5 years, in 10 years, in 15 years? They're like, I really don't want to be in this particular position. Well, where would you like to be in this? Is that within this organization, or do you see yourself elsewhere? It's not to then say, if the person says, well, I see myself working over at this other company that may be a competitor or not, and then you say, oh, well, we're going to find a way to weed this employee out. No, that's not the case. Is that the fact is that you're supposed to do what it takes as an HR professional to support people to get to where they want to go. The more supportive you are of your workforce and helping with them achieving their career plan, the more they give back to the company because they feel the support. They're not just a number. They feel like a valued asset within the organization. So let's look at some of the characteristics. You need to have accurate data. If it's inaccurate, whatever you collect, it's hard for you to then translate that into something that can be measured, tracked, and used to report on to say whether or not you're successful or not. They have to be linked to both your strategic and operational objectives. So what your long-term plan is and where you want to go, and then how you're going to operationalize it on the front line. They have to be clearly understood. Those calculations cannot have any kind of gray area. It has to be clear and concise. And you have to be able to provide measurements that your executives can value and be able to compare external and internal, the results that are before you in present time. And then, of course, that data that's measured has to help drive the management efforts from your HR department. So when we look at benchmarking and a balanced scorecard, benchmarking is the process of comparing your results as an organization to where the rest of the industry stands, both in standards or in their practices. And then your scorecard is a report that's going to look at a set of performance measures. And then from there, you'll see where you stand within those performance measures. So figure 213 is showing you the vision and strategy. So remember, your vision is where you want to be, and the strategy is how you're going to get there. So you have your internal processes that can help with conforming to standards and making sure that you're effective operationally. Your relationship with your customers. How satisfied are they? How loyal are they? If they're not satisfied, they won't be loyal. The financial measures, as far as are you profitable or not, and how will you utilize the capital that you have on hand. Learning and growth activities is how capable your employees are and how knowledgeable your entire organization is in a given area or areas. When we look at certain things, this is how we measure them. Return on investment is how we look at the amount that we invest in time and money in our human capital, in our talent, in our workforce. So whatever dollar amount that we actually invest in our workforce, how much of that is then actually coming back in productivity and other factors that we feel like, wow, okay, we have a return on our investment, and this is how soon we see that return on that investment. We're looking at the adjusted operating profitability figure, which is your HCVA, that human capital value added, that extra oomph, that the whipped cream and cherry on the sundae, right? That's the value added factor. And then when we look at the calculation of the amount of profit that we get from our investment, that is your capital return. Now, the last thing is your the wealth that is created per employee. You can actually break down versus an overarching amount that you have as your summary calculation of your talent pool. You can break things down per employee, which we talked about in chapter 1, where I can find out exactly how much it costs for me for each employee. Well, how much added value do I generate from this employee's engagement on a day-to-day basis in the workplace? For those of you, of course, we were like, we have to quantify this. There has to be a number involved. So we take our return on investment. That's what we're trying to find out. We're trying to ascertain our return on investment. So we're going to take the value of our gains from our productivity improvements. We know how productive we are over a certain time period. And from there, we're going to, what's going to be divided into that is our operating cost for any new or enhanced system that we use over a specific time, and any one-time cost that we're acquiring or implementing any human capital processes. We add those two together, divide them into the value that we gain from the productivity improvements, and from there, we're able to calculate what our return on investment is. And then, of course, here are the formulas for the other three, right? We look at HCVA, the human capital return on investment, as well as economic value added. You can see exactly how they're calculated. So it's not something that's just pulled out of the air, but literally you can see that this is how it's calculated. And what it is that this is usually built into a software program that those numbers are just plugged in, and after they're double, triple checked, they then come up with the final calculation. That information, of course, is shared with senior members. That information can be shared with board of directors, advisors, to then say, okay, here's how we stand. And this is how is something that is also factored in when you do consider a merger or acquisition. When someone's thinking, well, is it something that we want to consider with buying them out, so on and so forth. This is also when you think about when times get tough, if you're trying to consider whether or not you're going to do any massive layoffs, you can then see how much and in what regard your employees bring value and a return on the investment that you're currently giving. You may need to invest more or less, or you may need to just stay exactly where you are because you could be doing just a great job there. You have to, and we mentioned this in chapter 1 as well, is being able to audit your practices in HR. Some things are out of date, some things you're not consistent with, and so you have to look in the areas of staffing and compensation, how you go about staffing the full cycle recruiting, how you're compensating. Is everyone being compensated in the same regard? Are people being compensated in the same time frame? What are the factors that are involved with that? How are you considering health and safety of your employees? The compliance issues with any laws, the processes and record keeping that you have of your administrative team within HR, as well as how you're going about retaining employees and providing various benefits for them. Then we have the various levels that we audit, and here's the 5 where we're looking at compliance. We are checking our record keeping on both state and federal requirements. We're looking at regulatory compliance demands, as well as any benefits administration reporting as it tied to our benefit programs. We're looking at those immigration regulations and any requirements on the I-9 form, because sometimes there are changes. We're looking at specific program audits to see how we're doing as far as training, EEO, or compensation. And then your full audit is going to review all of that, plus any other HR functions that your company is involved with. So with that, that is chapter 2. If you have any questions, please email me. Thank you.